actually have two different types of TDRs, one rural to rural, and he said they really like it.
Yeah, good.
I'm waiting for the guests to get ready.
I don't know how we build this. Do we build this as a workshop or as a
Joint meeting,
joint meeting?
I'm gonna call you a
Then,
meeting.
in that case, I will call the meeting of the planning board together. We have all members present except Mike Baptiste, which his email came back to me, but I think he knows about the meeting. And in case anybody doesn't know Anthe, I want to thank her for coming in and doing this presentation. Anthe was chair of the planning board and the zoning rewrite committee. Also, were you chair of that?
Mhm.
Back when the discussions of TDR first came about, and we thought it was, she'd be the most well-versed person on the subject, so she graciously accepted our plea to help us go through this PowerPoint again.
You're gonna call the order meeting of the Board of Selectmen on Monday, November 5th at 7 o'clock. We have a roll call.
Mr. Chairman, all five selectmen are present, as is interim town administrator, Mr. Sullivan.
You're welcome and thank you for
Welcome.
your time. It's all yours.
Thanks.
Just speak into that.
Okay. I'm Anthe Frangiotis. I'm an architect and planner by trade. I did work very closely as planning board chairman on this particular subject, as well as through the zoning bylaw rewrite committee. George contacted me to give you an overview of the TDR concept, transfer of development rights. I specifically told him that I didn't necessarily want to get into the specifics, because as you'll see as we go through some of these slides, there are a lot of specifics to be had. And that's up to all of you moving forward to decide. What we've done is we have two PowerPoints that I had sent to Mr. Charbonneau and Mr. Barrett. They have not been edited, so we're going to skip through them. Some of them are specific to the work that was done in the past. I apologize for my voice. I can't kick this cold. But we'll go through the slides. This is a very good one to start with, and forgive me if you already know this, but I'm going to start from ground zero. Transfer of development rights is a land use management tool that permanently protects large tracts of land through permanent deed restrictions as open space by transferring the right to develop out of them. So it works with a fundamental principle that all property owners have the right to develop their land within certain parameters that towns and cities impose on them. There are three key pieces to this tool, if you will, one of which, and we'll talk about it a little bit, one of which is a sending parcel, secondly, a receiving parcel, and thirdly, the rate at which development rights transfer from the sending parcel to the receiving parcel. And that's pretty much the bare bones basics, and it goes from there. So this particular graphic shows you that parcel A has the right to develop 2 houses. Parcel B also has the right to develop 2 houses. A, in this particular case, is designated as a sending parcel, and they transfer to B, thereby preserving A in the third graphic as permanently deed restriction open space, with parcel B with 4 lots on it. This is a straight transfer. So you go from 2 lots, regardless of their size. This is just for general discussion. 2 lots, regardless of their size, that can each build 2 houses. You transfer 2 houses from A to B, and you end up with B with 4 houses and A with no houses. That's the basic. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to pass over this one. This you're probably all very familiar with, the town map. Currently, our town is zoned from Route 25 north in two large zoning districts, one of which is R60 and one of which is R130. If you own property north of Route 25, you're allowed to build one house on an 1.5 acre lot or one house on a 3-acre lot, which is known as large lot zoning. What we had looked at, what's next on the slides? What we had looked at primarily was the fact that north of Route 25 is where our environmentally sensitive land exists in the town of Wareham. Our aquifers, our Zone 2 areas. So those were the areas that had been identified with SERPID and the planning board at the time and zoning rewrite committee as areas to protect. There was a large representation of open space constituencies that were present, as well as the 80 Makepeace company throughout the entire process. So this particular slide uses an acronym called NULA, which stands for Net Usable Land Area. And it basically takes that parcel A that we talked about, because you have to determine how many lots are buildable by right in that particular lot. What you do is, if you have 5 acres and it's 5 acres of wetland, you're not going to transfer out that many units. So you need to figure out what the net usable land area is. So you take your gross acreage, you subtract your wetlands, you subtract all of these other things that are listed in this particular piece, and you end up with your NULA acres. And then you divide that by the number of acres in your particular zoning district. I think there's an example after this. So once you have that particular number, this is starting to get into some of the specifics that we were looking at. If you had 3 acres, 1 acre of which was your NULA acre, and you divided it by 3, this is a bad example because the math doesn't work. So we'll use a 300-acre parcel. Your NULA is 100 acres. If you divide that by 1.5, you end up with X amount of buildable units. That's a straight transfer. What we had looked at in terms of our formula or rate of conversion was taking that straight number and multiplying it by a conversion factor that was tied to the Wareham housing plan at the time. So that if you had the right to transfer 100 units and you wanted to build 2-bedroom townhouses, you take 100 times 1.4 and you would be allowed to build 140 units on the receiving parcel. Here's the example. So 400 acres, 300 acres of which are your net usable land area, NULA, in a 3-acre zoning district, which is our R130. You divide the 300 by 3, and you end up with 100 development units. You then multiply that 100 by a conversion factor. If we were trying to discourage single-family units, because single-family units are the most taxing on any community in terms of infrastructure, in terms of costs and services. So we knew from what we had read of other TDR bylaws that you had to provide some incentive for somebody to do this, because it is a lot of process to go through when they could just sit tight and do whatever the heck they want as of right. So we kept the single family as a straight transfer. So if you could transfer 100 units and you wanted to build single-family houses, we said you can only transfer 100. If you wanted to build 2-bedroom townhouse, you can multiply by 1.4. Assisted living, which we're very short of, and something that we wanted to encourage through this land use tool, we said the conversion factor would be 2 so that you could build 200 units, thereby achieving the goals of the housing plan, the town in general, as well as protecting environmental resources by ending up with sending parcels that have permanent deed restrictions for open space. I don't know what the et cetera was under there.
Well, it could be 40B housing units. That could be something that you'd want to encourage.
It could be. Yeah, I don't know what it was. This has been a while ago. So what we had looked at were different areas north of Route 25 that were large tracts of land that we felt at the time needed to be preserved and not built on. if the landowners north of 25 were to build out our town, we would end up extending infrastructure way beyond our means, and at the same time ruining a lot of natural resources. So we were looking to steer growth out of this particular area, out of the R60s, R130s. Some of the things that were discussed moving these development rights to areas that already exist, such as Onset Village and Wareham Village. These were other smaller villages that we had identified, West Wareham, South Wareham, Tyhonet, East Wareham, so that development could be driven there. What we learned by looking at just historic maps and information is that the town has developed in a series of villages, which has been very common for a lot of New England towns. We're not uncommon that way. Things were concentrated since the advent of the vehicle. Things ended up getting spread out a little bit more. And in previous planning discussions, the thought was that by increasing your lot size, you could deter growth. So communities started imposing 3-acre zoning restrictions, 9-acre zoning restrictions, all in an effort to deter growth. Well, what ends up happening is if somebody wants to build a house, they're going to build a house. If somebody wants to build 100 houses, they're going to build 100 houses. So this is, TDR in general is an alternative to a standard growth pattern. And our standard growth pattern right now is dictated by existing zoning bylaws. Not just our town, any town. You look at your zoning bylaw and you basically say, if this were all built out the way our zoning bylaw be, is it a place where I would want to be? Next slide. We also looked more regionally at the time because in terms of land use, in terms of land use and growth, doesn't really recognize town boundaries. Environmental resources don't recognize town boundaries. Those are legal descriptions. So we were looking at areas north and west of us, things that large land owners, yep. Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Gives me a break.
Could you just go back one slide? This one. So what you were saying is when you did all this, that you were thinking of taking parcels from north of 25 and moving them into some of those circles or creating a new circle?
Some of those circles, yes. So basically, when you draft a TDR bylaw, all of you, as well as a public process, need to determine, or someone needs to determine and or define where your sending parcels are, where are the development rights. So that needs to be mapped. So there were two, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say the other goal, other than, in addition to protecting open space, is the other goal of TDRs is to focus development where you want development, to discourage sprawl into the areas where the infrastructure of the town is not equipped to handle it.
And to compact it as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Because one of the issues that we have is when you draw that circle, the big circle, and you try to get national chain, or you try to get a hotel chain, or you try to get any of that, when you draw our circle, it encompasses all that water. So we lose most of the time because we don't have the numbers. And if I'm hearing you right, and if you built north of that, you would only get maybe 100. But if you did this and transferred those, you could almost get twice that much. Is that what you're saying?
We're basically,
Am I following this right?
we're basically saying, for instance, I'll just use Maple Springs core there because it's identified. I don't know how big that is. I think it's 300 acres. That particular property owner can build 100 houses there. We'd have to build roads, we'd have to get the fire there, we'd have to get police there, we'd have to get sewer there. We'd have to build the infrastructure that goes along with it. Of course, they're building the houses, they have to do some of that, but we're extending resources to that area. Meanwhile, that particular piece of property or that core area sits on our aquifer, land that we would want to protect for our water supply. By adopting a TDR bylaw, we say, let's put Maple Springs Core on a permanent deed restriction for open space forever for your grandchildren, never and ever, to enjoy the woods, the streams, the wildlife, and take those 100 units times whatever your conversion factor and build them in an area that's more appropriate. Build them outside of Wareham Village, build them, adjacent to Onset Village, so Onset Village expands, because that's more compact, as well as the fact that it's already serviced by our existing infrastructure. Our fire departments can get there. Our police departments can get there.
We have existing sewer and water.
We have existing
service
sewer and water service there. We're not running miles and miles and miles of sewer lines out to Maple Springs Core. Did that answer your question?
I think it does,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
And by doing that, you protect that land, but by compacting that, you could almost double our numbers when people come to look at that circle of commerce, right? To see how many people live in there, how many people are.
Right.
So
Exactly.
if you do that, we preserve the natural land that
Right.
we're talking, right?
Yeah, and this example probably isn't a very popular example, but I used to use it a lot. I would rather see somebody build 50 houses in Rose Point on the existing size lots that are there, rather than clearing 50 acres to build another 50 houses up in Maple Springs, you name it, anywhere.
Derek, is that what they did out your way?
Yeah, they had switched over to there, so they took one lot in an area that they wanted to preserve, and then built it up in an area that brought it to near the Wakefield Village area that already had the existing infrastructure. So
And when you do transfer from a sending parcel to a receiving parcel, the receiving parcel is defined, mapped, the same way that the sending parcel is mapped. In addition, the receiving parcel is also set up with a established set of design guidelines, so that you know that what you're getting is something that's going to be aesthetically pleasing, is going to work within the neighborhood. It's not like you're saying, okay, go build double the units that you can build there and do whatever you want.
And for instance, talking to the town planner in Plymouth, it's a special permit.
It is a special
They
permit.
can't just walk in and do whatever they want. They'd have to have a public hearing before the permitting board, and abutters would be notified, and it would be a public, open process. It's not like a developer can go around the public hearing process. It would be a special permit like other projects, and they would have to meet certain criteria.
Sounds
Anthony, can I
Yeah.
ask a question? And you may be getting I may be getting ahead of this, but
okay.
so we have a sending and receiving parcel. So what George brought up when he first came before the when you came before the board just before town meeting, he had a scenario that the person owned both. Whoever the entity was the sending and receiving. So they're going to fit into this criteria, and one's going to be open space, and they're going to be able to develop the second one. So this is assuming that both the sending and receiving are have the ability to be developed. Is that correct?
Yes, but it doesn't have to do with property ownership. So a sending parcel and a receiving parcel do not have to be owned by the same property owner in TDR context.
Right, and that was the only scenario because it was kind of unclear, or it seemed to be a little bit more complicated.
It is a lot more complicated, which is part of the reason. Sorry to interrupt you. As we went into this process and learned all of the nuances and had these hours and hours of discussion, part of the reason we said, let's start with sending parcels and receiving parcels that are under the same property ownership, because our town has the fortune, or some may think misfortune, of having that opportunity. There are other communities where that doesn't exist.
Right.
So, for instance, the Cape Cod Commission has a regional transfer development right bylaw, where you can transfer from town to town. And, the chances of both parcels being owned by the same entity is probably slim to none.
Was that their first step, though, having it regional, or did they have a local and then expand into a regional?
I don't know. The commission is new. New as of the 1990s. So I would think that
New
they
to us,
probably.
but
Yeah, I would think that they probably went, and they're a regional planning agency, so I think they probably skipped in town altogether piece and just went regional.
But naturally, having the sending and receiving parcels in common ownership makes it a lot simpler.
Certainly.
Right, because the other thing that you get into when you have sending parcels and receiving parcels that are in different ownerships is you have this potential market of selling development rights. And who determines the value
Right.
of what a development right is worth? Is
Right.
it the free market? Is it,
Is
or
it assessed? Is
is it
appraised?
assessed? Is it appraised? You almost end up needing an intermediary, and I'm not suggesting that this should be a municipal function, like a land bank, or so if Steve owns a large piece of property in the west and wants to transfer it to John's, Anthony is the land bank in between, or you end up the land bank ends up holding development rights. So if somebody does want to come to town, and they end up in a receiving parcel, they purchase development rights. It gets really complicated.
I imagine it would.
The reason I stuck with single landowner
Yeah.
it was to keep it simple.
Yeah.
Well,
You
and
can-
the other thing that you were discussing was the fact that we're not talking about the 5,000 square foot parcels here. Like for anyone that would be watching this, we're talking about, was it 10 acres? For this, I'm sorry?
It was 1 and 3 with the zoning. You're talking about the overall parcels?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
In order to qualify as a sending parcel, I believe there was a minimum acreage requirement of 100 acres. And I'm not looking at for sending, because when you think about it, the purpose of TDR is to preserve large tracts of land.
Exactly.
Most notably, the Pine Barrens in New Jersey have been conserved through a transfer of development right bylaw. So when you're sending from 100 acres or more so that you have a positive impact. And what we did look at, I don't remember who was in assessing at the time, but we had asked for an Excel spreadsheet, or we got a document that basically listed all of the property owners in Wareham that own 100 acres or more. Quite a few, including the town. So. We can skip one. This is an aerial view of the existing Tyhonet Village. And we were working specifically with the AD Makepeace Company, looking at an overlay district that would allow them to transfer from areas such as Maple Springs Core to their existing Tyhonet Village. And this was specific to that. We had a lot of conversations between Serpide, working on our behalf, on the town's behalf, as well as the company. These were some of the issues that were discussed.
Well, and that's the other aspect of this is by having a certain set of guidelines, one of those points is allowing a mixed use development, allowing mixed use of retail with housing, a mixture of housing types.
Mm-hmm. So, and this was all happening in the context of the Business Development Overlay District, which I know you're all familiar with here to the west, but these were overlay districts. These were various examples that were shown during the process in terms of mixed use, where you have retail below, apartments or offices above. We had gotten into specifics of, this was a potential receiving parcel, so we got into specifics of what size parcel you could develop on, how much, similar zoning issues, how much frontage you need, how much setback you need, how high you can go. Skip over that one. The design requirements that we talked about earlier, skip that one. We also looked at existing properties in Wareham Village. This particular one is a multifamily unit on Main Street. There was also one further down the road, because we got into this, you get into this big discussion about how many units per acre. And some people want to know, how many units are you going to allow per acre? So one of the things that we tried to get away from was the fact of getting away from the number and getting away from the calculator and actually looking at the visual. There's one property that looks similar to this. It's further down on Main Street next to the old screen house that has 4 units on it, and it sits on a 1/4 acre of land. when you do the math, that's 16 units per acre. So, but it looks similar to this, and it fits on our street, and you don't necessarily say, oh, good God, that's 16 units per acre, that's too much. So these were some examples that Greg Guimond is who we were working with at Serpide, and he was the one who had shared these images with us in terms of what different densities could look like. We created all kinds of matrix, as you can see, and comparisons. This was a good sort of summer slide. There's another presentation that gets into a lot more specifics. There were some duplications. John sent it to me earlier. But I can answer questions or...
Yeah, I'll apologize to the two gentlemen in advance. It's the only way I can understand something.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, you did some work in Onset a few years back, right?
Yes.
So let's say that, for example, we have a golf course
Mm-hmm.
in Onset, and they want to build 100 homes, right? We have some pushback against that. We say, it doesn't work, it should be 80, whatever, right? He goes to somebody in that district,
Sending parcel, yeah.
right? He goes up there and says to somebody else, hey, give me 100 acres. And then that 100 acres becomes permanently natural land. And he goes back to his original plan, and now he can put in 125 and make a golf course village. Is that what we're talking about? I hate to use, but it's the only way.
Yeah, no, it's, I mean,
Is
you
that
can,
all right?
you can use it that way. You know, if I owned 100 acres in a different property, I would say, you know, what's the incentive for me to sell to the golf course development? I mean, that's kind of where you get into what's the value of a development, right? And you know, what's a good deal? I mean, if the golf course owner thinks that it's a good deal to spend $2 million for development rights, you know, let him. Who's going to stop him?
Right.
The kind of stuff we're talking about.
That's basically what we.
Instead of that top guy building 100
Right.
houses,
Yeah.
Right.
he'd work a deal out with the guy in the village
Somebody else, yeah.
and say, hey, take these 100,
Yep.
put them to 150,
If-
and I'm gonna leave this pristine.
Right.
That's
If
what we're talking
that's pretty much what we're talking about. We're talking about
Two
a
different
part.
owners in that case.
A parcel of land being permanently restricted as open space forever and a day, and another parcel of land being developed probably at a higher density than it already is,
With,
closer to infrastructure.
with some advantages, you know, density isn't necessarily a bad thing. If it's planned and thought out, it can work very well. There's some examples of bad density, yes, but the beauty of this is it's planned and design guidelines, as Anthony said.
And to go through the process, they would still come to town, deal with the planning board, they have to do all the zoning, everything that anybody else would have to do.
The TDR bylaw would need to be written in a way that outlined a process, a special permit process, just the way any other bylaw is written. And it would spell out the steps that would be required. It was set up that the special permit granting authority was the planning board. It's a land use tool. It falls under land use. If you want to change that to include town meeting or board of selectmen or anybody else, you certainly can do that. It's up to you. You know, these different components just need to be defined. You need to define where your sending parcels are. I'm just telling you where we looked at them being, or potentially being, large zoning districts and or specific pieces of property. And you also need to define where your receiving parcels are. We looked at villages, and then we looked at potentially having new villages. Go ahead, Kara.
Anthony, I think, at least in my limited TDR experience, that Plymouth has been very successful with using this as a tool.
Mhm.
Have you looked at their bylaw?
Yes, we did look at their bylaw. Plymouth uses a rate of calculation that's based on the assessed value of a property. So whereas we as the town of Wareham had looked at this tied to our housing plan, they look at it tied to, and they may have changed this, so this was many years ago, they look at it tied to the assessed value of a lot. So their argument is this, and it's a valid argument, that not all building lots are created equal. A pond front lot is worth more, or a waterfront lot is worth more than a landside lot. So why should I, as a property owner of a waterfront lot, transfer my development rights out when I can sell the waterfront lot for X amount of dollars? Why should I transfer to get 1.1 or 1.2 units when I can just sell it as is? So they tie their rate of calculation to fair market value. We thought that was a little bit nuts.
The problem with that is.
But
in
it
the
works.
example
It works
we
for
used-
them. It works, and they have examples that have been used, but their rate of calculation is different than what we had looked at. And that's not to say that Wareham could, if you went forward with this, couldn't do a similar formula.
Well, the only reason that I ask is that I believe that the River Run project, which has been slowly, under construction, was the product of their TDRs and some other things. And I know at one point they were trying to use TDRs when the movie studio deal fell through, when they couldn't get the continuous lots. I'm not sure where they ended up with that. But they have been successful with it. And I think geographically we're similar to them. They have a lot of water. We have a lot of water. And they've managed to make it work where, quite frankly, while I support TDRs because I think they're an excellent tool to use, I think if we're going to pursue this, we need to model our bylaw after a community that's similar to ours that has been successful, because not all of these programs have been successful in all communities.
But also with caution, because not every, even though we're similar, we're not the same.
I'm
So-
not
Yeah.
saying that we are. I'm just saying we don't necessarily. I'm not sure how they do it anymore.
I would just, I know John spoke with Lee Hartman, their planner, earlier today,
Yeah.
so I'll let him speak to that. But I would just caution you away from copying and pasting a bylaw from another community as similar as we are to them, whether it be Plymouth, whether it be Carver, whether it be any other town.
Especially
and
something as
crafting it
complex as a TDR.
Right. But I know, go ahead, you could spoke to Lee.
Yeah, I spoke to the Lee Hartman over in Plymouth today, and he actually said that he would be perfectly willing to come here and to actually come before the Board of Selectmen, the Planning Board, or whoever, and actually speak about their experiences with TDRs in Plymouth. So he could actually talk about the examples that you just mentioned.
The problem I had with the value-based system was, okay, you've got pond front property, but it may require $1 million worth of infrastructure to get to it. So it is not really worth what waterfront property is without a large investment. And I don't see where a developer should get a bonus for that. He's actually saving $1 million worth of money to build a road out there. Why should he get a housing benefit on top of that?
Well, I'm not even sure that that's how they still do it, George. I'm just saying
And I
that.
don't know how it is
yeah.
gonna be,
But
like you
they've
said,
they've
it's
been
a while
able,
since we've looked
yeah, they've been able to manage their program far more successfully than many others, and they've been able to really aim their growth where they want it, and at the same time, their goal was to conserve a lot of these.
Well, and they also have, from what I understand from Lee, is they have almost like a two-tiered TDR. They have two different types, where they have one TDR in their bylaws that allows you to transfer from one rural property to another rural property. And then they have the more traditional TDR that allows you to go from rural to more of a village area. So
Which all has developed over time. And I guess that's the one other thing I would stress to all of you is that not only does the land development happen over a long period of time, potentially, but it's an evolving process. I mean, you start with a skeleton and you refine it and you work on it. It's a living document.
And I think some of it too is a little bit of trial and error. Unfortunately, when it comes to something like this, you can't predict every transaction or how it's going to turn out. But my question is that doesn't seem that there's any draft bylaw yet for us.
They gave us one.
Did they? I don't seem
There,
to have it.
there is a, there are multiple.
We got it
We do have
before
it.
town meeting.
Oh, maybe I left
I
having
don't
it in a
think
different.
Carol was there.
2006, so.
Oh, she missed it. Just to clarify before you continue, and I'm sorry to keep interrupting.
No.
At the year, talking about 100-acre parcels, which I'm kinda glad that there are still blocks of 100 acres that haven't been developed yet. I'm glad there's a list.
Yeah.
However, when members of the planning board came to the selectmen, they were talking more in, I believe it was 10 acres. So which is it
I
for this
believe
bylaw?
I believe some of our receiving parcels were relatively small. I don't know if we have.
on whether it's
but-
receiving.
Yeah, back then, going off the top of my head a couple of weeks ago, I think we were talking in the vicinity of 10 or 20 acres when we were discussing it. Obviously, we were talking much bigger than that, but
So this bylaw is addressing what acreage? This draft bylaw that I have here. What acreage is gonna be addressed here?
Is it the 2005 version?
yeah.
There were no sending parcels and receiving parcels identified in that bylaw. If you look at the first or second page under sending parcel, it refers you to a map or refers you to a description. It should be blank.
Well,
There's a
on page
paragraph.
4, I
I don't
have
have it in front of me.
a
so-
parcel contains 10 acres. Is that just for example, or is that actually, it says parcel contains 10 acres of land with wellhead protection. So 10 acres times 1.5 is 15 acres. So that was kind of the incentive. So, this is when we were having the conversation, we were talking about 10-acre parcels, my recollection. Was that just for an example, or is that
I believe
actual
that's what I gave as
acreage?
an example, because our discussion a couple of weeks ago was down to basic, one lot here to one lot over there, and I explained at that point it was a much bigger operation than lot to lot. It was,
I understand
Going
that,
back
I
to the
understand the
10 and 20
well, I
acres.
don't understand the complexity. I acknowledge the complexity of all of it.
Oh, you will.
However, that being said, my question remains when, if this is gonna be coming up in the spring, and I anticipate that it will, what acreage are we talking about? Is it gonna be,
what we would do is identify, not in the initial bylaw probably, but we would identify specific areas of town where, to use the previous example, anything north of 195, was it? And
25.
25?
so-
That's, the previous example would be by zoning district.
Yeah,
So
you could-
R60 or R130.
And you could identify, within that particular district, there could be landowners that qualify that, depending on the guidelines that we lay out, have 50 acres, but it's in the area you want to protect. If the bylaw allows, or if the final draft of this allows, you could reduce it to that growth if you wanted to. If you want to identify that as an area you want to protect and allow the transfer out, then
But as a first bylaw, is it going to be something as small as 10 acres, or are we gonna have it?
well, that still needs
I
to be
don't
hammered
know,
out.
we don't know, we don't know yet.
You'd really have
We-
to discuss
yeah.
that.
That's-
You
Well-
take the area that's north of 25, you might have, let's just say a number, you might have 10 people that have a 100-acre parcel, but you might have 40 people that have 10-acre parcels, but they're still in that area that you wanna protect.
Right.
So you'd have to have a pretty good, table discussion again of certain sizes or a
Right.
certain district.
Right,
So you may wanna take the whole area, and if someone comes in with 10 acres to send out, that's fine. If someone comes in with 100 acres to send out, then you'd be into the complexity of the, what did you call it, the banker of the
Yeah.
properties.
Right.
because-
Or land.
Land
the
bank.
land bank, because then the one that has 100 acres isn't gonna find enough land in one spot down in
oh, of course,
so
Right.
they need several. But someone with the 10 acres, they may luck out and find a particular street or two that had enough land to dump in the, what do you get for 10?
It depends.
15, whatever it was.
Right.
You know, so cause I had asked this way back during the discussions a few years back, is what do you do? Do you do 10 acres or do you do 100 acres?
right,
And my personal 2 cents gathering from Anthony in the discussion at the time was, take the area. So designate an area that you wanna protect.
Well,
And then, cause you might have, again, you might have 40 landowners on it.
And there's nothing that would preclude, or in my opinion, there should be nothing that would preclude 10 of those 40 landowners that each own 10 acres to get together amongst themselves,
Right.
hire one attorney,
Oh, sure.
and
Right.
file for the special permit collectively.
Right,
So
I
that they meet
understand.
that 100 acres.
But I guess I didn't want it to be, like, I didn't want to make it, I'm trying to make it too simplistic, and it's a complicated issue, for sure. And so I appreciate that. But it certainly never, well, it might happen once in a blue moon, maybe in my lifetime, but it might be a simple swap. I don't see it happening because the areas that we're trying to encourage development are already pretty dense. But we're identifying areas that we want to keep pristine. I absolutely agree with you there. No question about it. But I guess I didn't really appreciate what you were saying with the land bank, and that makes much more sense now. Thanks.
And you're right to the degree, you wouldn't want to make it, if you had somebody that owned thousands of acres, you wouldn't want them chopping that up into 10-acre parcels and doing a little at a time and avoiding possible mitigation that may be, so you'd have to build in some safeties into the process.
So, what, go ahead.
Who wrote that? Was it the planning board that wrote that original draft? Or did you work with zoning on it?
Serpent.
Yes, I believe Serpent did a lot.
Oh, someone else did.
But
Our
what,
regional planning agency wrote it on our behalf.
And then it was picked apart by various committees, and amendments were made and suggested.
And there are probably about 15 versions prior to that version, if you really would like some good nighttime reading.
but what about the scenario that, say, someone did own 200 acres? And they said, okay, I do want to develop and have these advantages and get these credits and enter into this agreement and go through the process. What's to prevent someone, like, say, I owned 100 acres north of 25 and wanted to enter into this, but where it's more densely populated and there isn't a whole lot of development, it may be a little here, a little there in the various villages, that I create a monopoly and I end up being the only developer in those areas. That's just the way it is.
Oh, is that, can I?
It's not a land use issue, I mean, that's a,
Right,
Right.
and I think Steve had hit the question of that, where you had the big circle, and then you have the next, where you spread that out just a little bit. I think that's what's gonna happen, is the village becomes from maybe a 2-mile radius, becomes a 2.5, or into a 3-mile radius. It still keeps the development in around where buildings are, instead of putting them all up in the back of the woods somewhere,
And
so.
existing
So,
infrastructure.
you know,
Yeah, you expand that village, like the Wareham Village would maybe go out a couple of extra roads or whatever it would be.
And it could spawn a proposal for a new village.
so there are, other scenarios. Go ahead.
John's point for a minute, sorry.
That's okay.
But John, what I'm hearing is, take Onset Village, right? Goes from up to the post office, you got Dudley Square there, and then you come out just a little bit, there's a sandwich shop, right? And you go past that a little further, it's Podunk. And you got some people out there investing money into their properties and their businesses, but between this line and this line, this could really benefit if someone was to come in. There's plenty of open land there, plenty of properties that are being abused and are eyesores to the village. And you could extend that circle out a little bit and put some nice village stuff in there, and it would bring that back, right? And then they could swap, and you get a piece of your aquifer protected, and you clean up that village at the same time.
Because if they develop that property to the north, you get sprawl, you get development and
Right, and it builds
stress
on top of
on
our
the
water.
infrastructure of the town where you don't want it. And meanwhile, that area you're talking about that's distressed is still distressed and doesn't get it.
Right, so you lose in that area, in that way, but then you have to provide services out there as well.
Exactly.
Let's look at
You mentioned that it was a public process. I think at one point you talked about the public would have input.
all of it should. Yep.
Is that common throughout the Commonwealth with other towns? I see that as a bit of a uphill battle, because because if you're in a community like, you know, Onset Village and you love it the way it is, and, someone does a transfer and they wanna do something to Onset Village and I live there and I like it, I'm not necessarily gonna be for the change, so. How common is that public,
If it's the way that we looked at it in the bylaw, it was a public process because it was a special permit. So I don't think in our Commonwealth, and somebody else could probably speak to this better than I could, that you could do it without a public process.
It would be incredibly difficult.
It would be
Yeah.
incredibly difficult to
It
do
would
it.
be
I mean,
through
you would
a
either
special
have,
permit, you'd have to go through town meeting, I mean,
Yeah.
because you're basically doing a radical change in your zoning bylaws.
Right.
Either by way of a new bylaw.
Yeah.
Or by way of
The-
changing existing.
But I-
you know, the other issue that you could do here, I mean, you can look at it this way, is if you don't utilize this tool, you could rezone the entire town to meet what you're trying to do.
And you know
But that's also
Yeah,
an
the bridge
uphill.
too
That's
far.
yeah, that's a bit too far. So it really is.
You may get some kickback through a public hearing, but what if you don't do a public process and you try and people think you're trying to sneak something
Yeah,
in?
exactly, if you're trying to ramrod it and then.
Right, so the alternative is even worse. What's that? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
The other side of the coin is, you can't stop them from building a house there. They have the
Where
right
they
That's
are,
right.
Exactly.
to develop.
To develop it within the parameters that you've established.
What this is doing, this actually works to our favor,
Exactly.
where you can help one owner who wants to do something and one who doesn't, swap the properties, then we could have a nice home and a half, still dense, right? Cleans it up, everybody, landowner A, me, especially the town, we win.
So one other,
Otherwise,
yeah.
that property could just sit there as an eyesore forever, and you can't do anything about it.
Yeah, and then
Or
you
then
clear,
you build a big house on it, and then you lose again, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so the other thing for you to consider, and you know, it's not specifically listed in here, is to think for receiving parcels outside of village districts. You know, the town is undergoing a lot of redevelopment. East Wareham is is empty. You know, 6 and 28, the way we know it since Wareham Crossing has come in, has really siphoned the development out of Cranberry Plaza. You know, Main Street has the same issues it has today, it had 5 years ago before Wareham Crossing. So what really, in my mind, having sat back and watched it for a while, it really isn't, that particular discussion isn't about David and Goliath, that's about Goliath and Goliath.
Yeah.
So, you know, looking at the East Wareham Plaza, which is right up here on your maps, I mean, to add density to that plaza is not a bad thing.
No.
You know, to add housing above, or, you know, there's those properties. You know, the other piece is Wareham Crossing. Wareham Crossing is a series of one-story buildings. And we did our best to make it as aesthetically pleasing as possible in the look of 2 stories, but it's all one-story buildings, and it's, you know, it's in the industrial zone. But there are a lot of things that can be considered, you know, and even to the point of saying the Westfield property that the town owns is in an R60 zoning district. The town transferring the development rights, because they're a property owner, out of that particular parcel into a West Wareham village, into 5 Corners, or, you know, some particular other node, you know, or to 58 and 28, which abuts Rochester. You know, there are a lot of different scenarios that you can think of that are outside of the villages that wouldn't necessarily stress the existing villages, but would develop in more compact patterns versus this.
Well, I think that's the thing going forward. I mean, if you're looking, for example, Mr. Chairman, to direct swaps with blighted areas in Onset, you can identify areas in Onset that would get a higher density bonus, for example, or would be, you know, more advantageous for somebody to swap to, and you could scale it back from, you could devise a list, for example, of, okay, these are the most desirable areas that we want to clean up. And they may not be the most desirable areas where people want to build, so in order to incentivize people to go there, you give them a higher density bonus so they get more bang for their buck when they're building, and that way make it more attractive for them. And then, of course, as you get closer to the areas you want to protect, you provide less of an incentive, less of an award to swap. So it's a process you can use to not only protect large swaths of land, but you can also sort of target where you want the developers to go.
Yeah, see, when I'm trying to think, just thinking out loud, using some real examples, because I can better understand it that way. But if you just go to Onset, right, Onset Village, you got like the library, right? They just did all that, spent all that money, invested all that money in the library. The next house is falling apart. The next house is already falling apart. Got sticks holding it up, right? The guy on the corner cleaned that property up. Then you go across the street, and I think we're at the church.
You skipped a couple buildings.
Oh, there's a couple of buildings.
Yeah, the
right?
white one and the red one.
And then you go down past the church, and it's a mess.
Yeah.
And all I'm saying is, if we took those 6 parcels in that false sale, I think of an acre or smaller, but you add all that up, and we get somebody up north to give up 10 acres, we could clean that whole area up with an interested developer, right? Clean up the village, extend the village.
Yeah, you can do that, and you can do that also in the context of rezoning the areas you want to fix. You can call them, economic target areas, or whatever term art you want to use, and then proceed from there to create the incentives to do this. The other thing is once you pass one of these, and you find out what in your law works and what doesn't, you can always revisit it. It's not etched in stone forever and ever. The only thing that's etched in stone is once you make the actual deals themselves through the special permit process. Those, of course, are final. But anything that happens, after that point in time, if you decide it's not working the way you want to, or it's not hitting the areas you want developed,
Or nobody's using it.
or nobody's using it, which is the sign that it's really not working, then you go back and tweak it and make it better.
It ends up being the same as what we have now. It goes through a special zoning permit, and the zoning board makes that decision, right?
CBA.
Correct? You guys look at it, and then it goes to special permit, goes to zoning.
It depends.
Depends
It
on-
depends, Steve. The zoning board of appeals has special permit granting authority, certain special permit granting authority, not all, some.
So in the bylaw, in this bylaw,
The
when
planning board would be the special.
should be put in there, who has the,
You
Under the,
You could define your special permit granting authority to be, I think, maybe this is being too radical, but it can be 2 members of the planning board and 2 members of the zoning board. Maybe it's some other composition, but most towns, because of state laws and so forth, you use an already established board. But if you really wanted to,
Which makes it very important that you come up with a formula that anybody can interpret. The same board 10 years from now can look at this bylaw and interpret it the same way that people, when you get into, that was one of the things about the value of the property is it could be interpreted so many different ways if you're trying to transfer based on value. One of the good things about this process is it does allow for mitigation, which we don't usually get to do in a standard subdivision. And the design criteria, we get a lot more input as to what goes on.
and the planning board could bring in, under 53G, a peer review consultant if it's a scope of a project that they need some kind of consultant to
Right.
come in and
And
analyze.
you use Onset as an example. A few years back, there was a developer looking around Onset and noting the similarities between that and Nantucket, and with the harbor and the way things are laid out and the hills. But we didn't have anything in our zoning handbook or bylaw that would allow that type of a density for one, and the incentives to go along with it. Where if people get a little bit of a push to save some money on this side to be able to spend a little more over there, you can encourage that sort of thing.
Well, I think, Steve, you brought up a good example with, you may have a nice property next to a few different blighted properties, and what sometimes people misunderstand with the NIMBY syndrome, not in my backyard, is they say, well, how's it gonna affect my property values? Well, the blighted areas next to you right now are decreasing your property values. Would you rather have the blighted, low density, or a tasteful, slightly higher density that's gonna enhance your property values?
I think the reality see that, that's their village.
Yeah.
So if they had an opportunity, that existing owner is never gonna change,
Right.
right, for the most part. And if you could swap owners and develop something, now everybody's happy.
And under the public hearing process, they have the right to come in to the public hearing
Sure.
and comment and
Yep.
see what's going on and have a role in that process of what's gonna go in their neighborhood.
Well, the other
Let me
piece,
Go back to some of those pictures. Are you still in that presentation?
I think we
no.
switched, yeah, we switched.
Hold on, they may be in here. No, they were in the other one. Let me go back to the other one.
Maybe pull that up
Oh,
and
okay.
just show us some of those pictures again. I think it's important to look
There's-
and see what some of the success stories were. Maybe you can find it.
Yeah, hold on, Steve, we'll get to it.
Or-
We had some
Lot
nice
more.
examples there. Look at this.
that's nice looking.
Look at the property next to the library. And imagine that white building
Yep.
there. Who's
That
gonna
fit in
object
very
to
well.
that?
Or that brick building to the left of that.
Yeah.
Well, the other piece to this that maybe it's so obvious.
This in the corner doesn't fit that particular area, but a nice.
No, but corner lots.
Yeah.
Others on Main Street too, that would, maybe that existing property can be converted.
Somebody just emailed me a picture very similar to that white building, and it was a McDonald's.
It was
That's
what?
in
It was a
Maine.
McDonald's.
Yeah.
They, due to a historical district, they wouldn't let them tear the building down, so they,
And Anthony brought up another very good point earlier in the conversation when she showed that picture of that, I think it was that shingled house. Sometimes people don't, yeah,
yeah.
sometimes people aren't even aware of how dense some buildings are right around them.
Yep.
They don't realize how many units are in the building that looks like a Victorian house.
That one I think is 3 units.
Yeah, that one right there.
Yeah, there are a couple of
How
them.
many people
think
know
it
that
might be-
that's 3 units?
it might be
around?
full.
Well, one thing this can do too is once you set it up, for example, so that you can do the small scale swaps with the blighted properties, you've just increased the value of those blighted properties. You've made it more likely that the people who hold on to them are either going to sell them or they're going to get off their tails and do something with them. So, and once you start increasing value, from the municipal side of the coin, you start seeing higher property taxes, and that's something.
I would think
Revenues
that-
is good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would think that there are any number of scenarios that the bylaw could address, and as it evolved, it could address large tracts of land that are exchanged for new villages that are equally as large or maybe just smaller. Or it could also address large tracts of land being preserved and then infilling development, which is what all of you have been talking about with the blighted properties. And I would think that each of those scenarios would probably have its own nuances. And there's nothing to hold you back from having multiple scenarios in the bylaw for consideration.
Going forward, at this point here, we obviously know there's probably a few pieces that we have to the north that have the 100 to 200 acre possibilities. And that's pretty straightforward to put put the bylaw in place for, or at least write it out. So I would imagine going forward, we should probably take the different examples and start to lay it out so it all makes sense. Because, you can use the word low-hanging fruit. The simplest one is we have one landowner in town that has large lots. So they have the ability to do something. So that's an easy one. It's these other pieces you're gonna have to sit and do some work on. Because you're talking almost about, the TDR is almost becoming economic development, redevelopment for downtown areas. And the idea of villages, today, everywhere, the only thing that's sustainable long-term now is the village concept. The idea of sprawl and having 2 and 5 acre houses, with land with 5,000 plus square feet and stuff doesn't work anymore. Actually, you can't even sell them anymore right now. So the idea of developing a village concept and pushing what I used to call cluster zoning is the most effective way to use land and keep open space. So at this point here, I think the simple thing to do is just start to go piece by piece, take the simplest piece, put that in, and just keep moving along. Because this is easy to put together. You just have to think it through. It really should be the planning board. The planning board is the legislative branch of our town as far as the zoning goes, bylaws. It's their bailiwick. What doesn't fall with them falls with ZBA, and conservation comes in.
No, I mean, honestly, this was progressing rather nicely,
Until that point,
until we got to a point where we just beating our head against the wall, so,
Well, one of the things you can do too is, you can have periodic meetings with this board. Obviously, when you're looking to adopt, is certainly when it's time to put it on a town meeting warrant, you gotta have a public hearing. But I would suggest that even in the process as you go forward, intermittently anyway, you don't wanna do it every time you discuss this, you'll never get anything done, because you'll get people showing up with a million questions. But intermittently, of course, you could announce a public hearing, and you could take whatever draft you've got at that time and show it to people. So,
By the time you get to the public hearing, about a month before a town meeting, you really want it to be polished. You don't wanna have any major changes coming.
right, and you don't wanna have to explain a whole heck of a lot at that time either. You want people to already sort of know what the thing is.
Well, any of those meetings could take place here, in this room. And, you have access to the room, you have access to the cable. We could have announced, right, so that those discussions can be ready, people can sit home and watch it from TV. I think we have the best of both worlds. You're laughing at me, what?
well, I think where we were when we first did this presentation was, we then invited some of the stakeholders
Right.
to the table to come in and give us their take on it and kind of kick the tires a little. And, that
How
maybe,
did that work for you?
that may be these meetings were very, very good for the process. There was a lot of information exchanged, questions answered. Of course, when you get a group together, you always get more questions that you gotta go answer.
So, okay, so I'm missing something.
For
Tie rod in the side of my head. I'm missing something. What am I missing?
I was just proposing maybe that's where we should pick it up again, is have another meeting and invite some of the 100-acre property owners to participate and see what we can do about attracting people that would be receiving parcels. I mean, we've identified the 100-acre property owners, we haven't really identified the receiving property owners other than areas of town.
I think
And
one of the
keeping
things,
it, I think, sorry, I
Go
think
ahead.
if I can just jump in, I think keeping, not necessarily loose, but defining areas that already have concentrations of development may make sense. You know, for instance, there's what I call East Wareham Village, that 5-point intersection at Depot Street. You know, there's the area in West Wareham where the gas station is and the carriage shed and N-Star is, and over on that end of
Doty
West Wareham,
Street.
Doty Street. You know, really looking at sort of where those, you know, I was surprised to learn about South Wareham, not to offend anybody. It was on the map.
It's interesting
We're
to go
trying
from
to-
Wareham to West Wareham and to go through South Wareham.
Right. Anyway, that was just my.
Can I
Yeah,
just
stuff.
ask, because I kind of flipped through your second presentation, which is similar to the
Yeah,
first.
which is part.
But
yeah,
I wanted
these were used
to-
at 2 different times, so.
But I wanted to ask you, this kind of gives a timeline, it's kind of a history of you guys trying to do this before. Can you kind of run us through that and see where the hangup was? It says transfer of development rights timeline. Mm-hmm.
So the zoning bylaw rewrite committee was formed in 2003, 2004, somewhere along there. And Rick Tainter was the consultant that we utilized for the rewrite. In that rewrite, that's his name there in 2004. That was funded by a grant, his work was, as well as a rewrite of the subdivision rules and regs. That grant money, as you can see, this went on for 2 years, was utilized, that contract expired, and we continued to work with SERPIT, our regional planning agency, to continue passing along. At some point in this timeline, the zoning bylaw rewrite committee was disbanded or sunsetted by the then Board of Selectmen. And the work that the committee was doing was taken on by the planning board to continue the piece of our work. You know, the zoning bylaw in general is a living document. I know we just made some changes at town meeting to it again. He went to the planning board, and as the planning board, we were meeting with the Board of Selectmen in a similar manner to this, to keep things going.
Okay, the tire iron just hit me on the other side of the head, I got it.
What happened with,
I understand.
staff and ADM are not satisfied with outcome? What happened in that whole time period there? September of 2005, October of 2005, what was going on there?
Committee votes the 4 drafts if revisions can be.
So, the long and the short of it came down to. All right, no, you weren't sitting here. The long and the short of it came down to, we had committee meetings. I chaired committee meetings where 25 people showed up at any given meeting, and we were meeting on a weekly basis. And I think all of you know, for a committee meeting, if 25 people show up, that's a pretty darn good showing, you know, of various entities and different representations. You have 2 tonight. During that time, we were meeting on a weekly basis from August 2005, actually probably before that, July 2005 through the end of the summer. And all of you are familiar with town meeting calendars, right? So you meet in October, but you have to be done in August. So the fact that you said earlier, Mrs. Begley, that this would be done for spring, I was this will be a marathon for the planning board. Good. But we were meeting on a weekly basis. There was a vote taken at the zoning bylaw rewrite committee meeting. The meeting wasn't properly posted. We were up against a town meeting deadline. The chair at the time and I had words regarding the issue. I pulled the warrant, the draft bylaw, which basically was there. I pulled the guts out of what we had voted. I pulled out the conversion factor. I left everything blank because a TDR bylaw that has blank descriptions is of no use to anybody. So had it been put on the warrant and voted upon, nobody would have been able to use it. We would have continued our work as we went on. Properly posted meetings did everything that we were supposed to do. That's not the way that it happened. It got pulled from the warrant because of personalities and because of deadlines that we weren't able to meet because it was just impossible. So basically, I was on a Friday morning up against the gun at work, full-time job, not volunteer job, needing to decide what we were going to do because Serpent wasn't happy with the changes, ADM wasn't happy with the changes at the time, and in a last-ditch effort to at least keep the work moving forward.
So that's what skeleton TDR means.
That's what skeleton TDR means, which I'm assuming that 2005 bylaw is that skeleton TDR. So the stack of paper that George has in front of him this evening is basically this timeline in bylaw format going forward. And that exists in bound copies. It's part of the town public record.
So what I'm seeing on here where it says Serpent and AD Makepeace and all of that, that's in reaction to the scenario you just portrayed.
Yeah, it basically came down to town meeting deadlines, committee meetings that were happening for a period of a long time, you know, and up until that point were occurring weekly with a lot of discussion back and forth, revisions to this. So to say that, you know, this has a lot of guts is an understatement. I mean, the details are just...
Was AD Makepeace on the committee?
They were not on the committee, no.
They
No,
were
but they
there
were
as interested
present.
party.
Yeah, they were interested party.
Were they the only major landholder that was present?
They were the ones who were attending, yes.
Oh.
There may have been some other landowners in the process that came to a meeting here or there, but let's face it, I mean, Mr. Slavin mentioned it earlier. They have the ability to do it one way or the other, and they are in the business of real estate development. You have to address it one way or the other.
There were some strong personalities at the time, one of whom was my own mother, as I recall, involved in this process. And A.D. Makepeace had a strong personality or two on board at the time. There was a lot of headbanging. I think the environment is a little bit better now to try to get something done,
You know, and
on both sides.
you know, to your mother's credit, there were a lot of open space constituencies that were represented. I mean, we had people coming from the, she was an open space constituent.
Yes, she was, a
Um,
big proponent of
But,
open
you know, and
space.
it was a regional discussion. I mean, if you look at some of the correspondence that's part of that packet, the CC list is quite long. And they're CC'd because they had been coming to the meetings.
Serped now, we use them as our grant hours to put a lot of this together?
I would suggest that you do.
No, we did before, did we not?
We did before, but we used much more than just their technical assistance time.
Okay.
We were able to leverage, I don't know specifically which grants they were,
Well, I know
but
Anthony and I spoke this morning on the phone, and I actually just submitted a successful grant in the town of Rochester. Town of Rochester's doing a village center overlay district.
Yeah.
And when we had a forum on a Saturday morning during the summer, some of the people who would be within this district expressed some concerns about the type of buildings, the type of development that would occur. So the South Coast Rail grant opportunity came up late in the summer. So I submitted a grant, and we received $15,000. Serpent has a software that they can do visioning, where they can actually do a computer-generated depiction of a building. So we're gonna meet with the landowners within this village center overlay district one-on-one to see this is the type of development we're talking about, to kind of ease their fears as far as what type of development would go in under this overlay district. So that's one example of the type of technical assistance we could receive to help with something like this.
So basically going forward, if the planning board needs more help as far as some of the detail work, I believe we get 40 hours. Unfortunately, I think 20 hours just recently got pulled for.
I'd have to check on how many hours.
I think we have 40. We get 20 and 20. I think they used the planning board 20 hours just recently for the, I think Tremont for 21E. But the Board of Selectmen has 20 hours. So we could direct those hours for that project.
And also,
And that would help.
Like after our discussion this morning, I was gonna, start looking into potential grant opportunities to help with this.
You could probably ask Sal from CETA to look what he has and also see what Serpent has, because this is something that they've been after for quite a while as well. So they'd be
Yeah.
more than happy to go back into this.
And this is 2006 data. There's a lot more stuff since then.
It has to be updated.
that we can reflect on.
And we really have to figure out exactly where the parcels are we want to work with and get it dialed in a lot closer.
And to go back previously, when this came up, it was during the zoning rewrite committee's work. And happened to be there that night when ADM gave a presentation. And the 2 times they gave presentations, I happened to be there. Both times, the rewrite committee was very specific, saying they didn't feel that that it should be part of their work, that it should be a larger decision of the planning board, Board of Selectmen as a policy decision. And that's what we were striving for. And unfortunately, things went awry, because there was a lot of good work put into this, and it needed to continue, because I think it would have been very beneficial to all involved.
Well, we can, if that's the issue, George, we can meet anytime we want as a joint board. Work
Well,
through
I
this.
think that's
That-
important
that
that we're
was
all on the
that's,
same page.
that
We
was,
can work as a joint board and.
You know,
I think that's what,
Zoning people into at some point, right?
I think that's what George's intent here is, and part of the reason that I agreed to come, because when we left off, one of my last meetings regarding this issue was in this same room in a joint workshop, and the planning board at the time was trying to continue the work that had been done, and basically had their legs cut out from underneath them, because there was no interest in having this discussion in this format. And what we heard was that it was Board of Selectmen issue, wasn't a planning board issue. So we said, great, here you go, or let's meet together.
It's a
And
town issue.
it was it's a town issue.
Why would it be our issue? We're a policy board, we don't
Yeah, well, because it was seen at the time, by that board as a policy issue. And, this is what we were trying to do at that time, to continue the conversations, to say, okay, you want to make it a policy issue, you want to be part of the discussion, we're okay with that, we wanna keep going. But we weren't given that opportunity, so.
Obviously, things work a lot
Starting here
smoother
is-
when everybody's on the same page.
Yes.
Right, so, we don't need to,
Can I just
we don't
ask-
need to beat that dead horse.
Can I just ask another question, please? For, how is, obviously, you're having to work within, this was a discussion we had earlier, George, was with affordable housing, open space, and the master plan. Master plan needs work, however. Have you had any input or, discussions with, as the committees for the open space committee and the affordable housing recently? I'm sure you did then. But have you included those committees just to get everybody on the same page? I think it would be a mistake to get planning, board of selectmen, affordable house, all of us in the same room. It just becomes counterproductive. But if all in the same room,
Get 4 or 5 committees in the same room.
in the same room, all at the same time, I'm saying planning, since they're working on this, if you had open space, a joint meeting with open space committee, for example, and then another time do you understand what I'm saying, Peter?
Absolutely, and I think going forward, I think we have to acknowledge that planning needs to take the lead on this, that the Board of Selectmen need to be involved, as much, to sort of shine a light on what's going on and to help with the public perception of what's going on. But I think that it would be more helpful, for example, if you met with affordable housing, if you met with open space, then have all of the boards, and then you can tell us what the input is. I don't think we don't need to be hooked together for every single step of the plan.
No,
Well,
but just
that's not the-
periodically come back before the
That's-
board of selectmen.
Yeah,
That's not the
exactly.
intent.
Every month or so, if we could, I mean, I will say, Mrs. Bedley, your aspirations to get this on the April town meeting warrant are noble. I will put them-
Yeah, but
I'll
I
put
do
it that way.
I do things like that. I'm on committees in my church. I do the same thing to them. So don't feel like you're special.
Obviously,
Don't think you're special, because I'm always like, let's go, let's go, let's go.
I just don't want you to be disappointed when I'm not gonna make the sausage, so.
If there was no major roadblocks,
Well, that's a
everything
different,
you've done.
well,
I mean, how far away are you?
we could take this into April with what we
yeah,
have, but
but you know what?
I don't think that would fly. Nobody would be happy with
If-
it.
Falls more realistic.
Yeah, because if you're talking about having meetings with these different committees and talking to stakeholders and looking into grants and talking to Serpent, I mean, you'd have to have this done within the next 3-4 months, and that's just.
Well, it's moving just as quickly as, DOT with the highway.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but I think that having the conversations now, because if you make, as we all know, offending people is with the biggest obstruction, or even perception of offense, right? So if people are getting in before we get too far from affordable housing, from open space, or even having this forum, and this is being filmed and televised, getting people in on the ground floor as opposed to, okay, this is completed, here you go.
Oh, absolutely.
you can't-
You have to have
do that.
you have to have consensus building, no question.
You know,
But I think getting these people in on board early on. But personally, I agree with my colleagues. I don't need to be part of that. And sometimes, if we get too many people involved, and everybody needs to be heard, nothing happens.
Well, obviously, that's the purpose of this meeting tonight, is to bring everyone up to speed. And to look to the Board of Selectmen and say, are we going to roll our sleeves up and dig into this? Are you gonna support us?
Would you like, you want a motion?
That, and
Before you do that.
if we have your support,
1 second, please. You brought this up, to the board. What's your expectation?
Time-wise?
Sorry?
Time-wise?
Yeah, you brought this up.
Well, I think I started,
You wanted it to be on the agenda.
yeah, I started probably
You're driving it forward. What's your expectation?
well, I started 3 months ago, so we're 3 months late getting to it. Normally what happens is fall town meeting is where you try and do your zoning bylaw changes, because normally your budget and stuff is done in the spring. So I would not expect, I would kind of demand that we have this ready for fall town meeting.
And I'm not a big fan of rushing complicated zoning bylaws
Not,
anyway.
not one,
This will be the most complex thing that this town has ever done zoning-wise.
Yeah.
That I can assure you.
no, you have to get all the stakeholders in, and this is gonna take a little bit of time. and you really wanna make sure you got
What we
it
were
in.
looking for at this point is your support. I know there's gonna be items you're gonna disagree on, but as long as we can have an honest discussion on those, we can work through them. Because if we don't have your support, we're just wasting our time.
I'll put it bluntly, the conversation ended because the two boards had a diametrically opposed point of view regarding the issue.
And
Well, it doesn't
So
sound
if
like-
it's,
it doesn't
if
sound like
that's not the case now, then move forward. I think what George is probably asking is, if you're diametrically opposed to having this conversation, it's not worth the time and effort.
Well, I would hope that from the, George, I would hope from the tenor of the conversation tonight that you're perceiving that you're getting the reception that you came here to get.
I'm optimistic.
Okay, well, then maybe that should be your guide.
Yeah, because I'm not sensing, I'm sensing that this is something that the Board of Selectmen is interested in moving forward with and pursuing.
Well, I think if it's successful, it answers a lot of our problems.
It could, yeah.
It could be a huge help.
It could bring us some very nice projects and some exceptional benefits.
It's not a guarantee, but it's a tool, it's a potential tool.
Basically, development has, especially subdivisions, et cetera, has all died. And in order to get us going, we need to start to work, to push things through like this. We can't be difficult anymore.
Anthony and Peter brought up a good point, because when I was in Framingham, they had an over 55 housing bylaw that had been on the books for probably 4 or 5 years and nobody had used it. And to this day, probably, I don't think, I talked to my boss in Framingham today. Nobody's used
Still
it.
have it.
It's been 10 years, nobody has taken advantage of the over 55 housing bylaw, so you don't want a dead bylaw just sitting on the books.
I know that, just by the work that we've seen here, that everybody's done a great deal of research. Has other communities I know have TDRs. Are there things that we're learning from those other communities that they did or didn't do?
Well, I would like, again, I just had my first conversation with Lee Hartman in Plymouth today. I'd like to talk to him again and have a more detailed discussion with him about.
Well, I don't mean just Plymouth
Well,
either.
that's where Serpent is helpful,
Yeah.
because they touch
Serpent.
on all these communities, and they can answer those questions and help us pull it together.
Yes.
Because, I mean,
27.
I don't, I'm a,
Oh, 4 of them?
I'm a firm believer in not reinventing the wheel. And if someone else, and I'm not saying that we're the exact same communities, because it might be something that didn't work for them, could work very well for us. But just kind of, I would appreciate the research going into other people who already have the experience with something like this.
And the thing is, I think what's important is, a lot of legwork's are already been done, but however, since so much time has passed, I think,
You'd have to go back.
We need to, we can't just say, okay, here we go, make a couple tweaks and present it.
No, we're going to have to recalibrate going forward. But I will say to your point, Mrs. Begley, I'm probably the only person in this room who actually enjoys writing law. So
Well, that's,
However, not in your capacity as an elected official.
the other thing is, some of these TDI bylaws have been out there. This is 2006 information. They've been out there, and you can say, what would you change if you were doing it again?
You should tie it to a larger,
Ellen, you're very correct, because one thing I like to do when taking examples, I don't like to just use one town. I like to find 3 or 4 different towns, and that way, because no 2 towns do things identical, and you can say, okay, well, what works for us? If we look at what they've done and what they've learned from it. So yeah, I'd like to
think-
find a few more examples.
I think Serpent's, I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
Oh, I was just gonna say, you can learn from the commonality. If you survey a group of towns, you find out what worked, what didn't work, you can avoid some pitfalls.
Isn't
Because some things are gonna be common to most. I mean, then you have to massage it for your community, but you can still avoid some pitfalls you can find by surveying these towns. What worked, and if you find the same thing worked in 4 or 5 different towns, then it's probably something very good.
Isn't Serpent
You know,
toying
things
with
What's that?
regional stuff?
What's that?
Isn't Serpent toying with regional?
Well,
TDI?
Serpent
I think that would be a hard
Serpent has
sell.
been encouraging different aspects of regionalization, and there are some that work, there are some that are more difficult, and I talked with Anthony about this today. In to regionalize TDRs, how the heck is that gonna work? One town gets the density while the other town gets the protected open space, I mean.
I'll stay out of that
Yeah,
conversation.
No
exactly.
kidding.
You know, I was at a joint transportation planning group meeting, a few months ago at Serpide when Ross Perry got up and talked about sharing things like street sweepers. Well, even that, okay, well, if two towns are sharing a street sweeper, where is it housed when it's not being used? Is it being taken care of? If Wareham shared something with another town, how are we to know that they're taking care of it and maintaining it properly when it's not here? So,
But that's the contractual agreement. But how many towns in this area, does anybody have this answer, have TDRs?
we don't know. I don't know that off the top of my head.
The only one that I know that's been successful so far has been Plymouth.
Yeah, but
so-
how many have it? They may
I don't
not
know.
use it. As Anthony said, we could you guys could do all this work and it doesn't happen.
Carver has made an attempt. I don't know if they passed it or not. At the same time, Serpide was working with us. Greg was also working with the town of Carver.
But
I
even
don't know
if
if
we
they
looked
passed
at
it or not.
like, if there's Cape Cod towns or, because there's another
The
place
Cape Cod,
that's.
yeah, the Cape Cod Commission has a regional one, as I mentioned earlier, and that's been.
Well, I think we can look anywhere. I mean, there's no reason why we couldn't take something from some of the Middlesex County towns, for example. I
Well-
mean, they may not be beachfront communities, but they're, you know, semi-rural in character, so, you know, there's,
Something I'd have to do some research into this.
so,
But
yeah,
just-
you can get some junkets out of this, I
So-
think, John.
I would think that the piece that needs the most updating is the fact that that particular conversion factor was tied to the housing plan, and I don't believe a current housing plan has been done.
Yes,
And what
I
has it?
think they're in
on housing
process.
needs? Okay,
I think that the housing
Okay.
plan is in process.
so,
Am I
you know,
right?
those are,
It's done.
Public, it's been.
The draft,
The planning board has seen the draft of it. It's
Okay.
online at our public meeting
Good.
Thursday, Anthony, on the production plan.
That's,
We're that close.
2 o'clock in the
Good.
afternoon, so that's the public
So,
hearing.
well, the
This
point,
Thursday,
the
we've
point
got the
is,
Affordable Housing Trust presenting the draft housing plan. I announced it 2 weeks ago.
the point I was trying to make was that, you know, the way we were drafting the bylaw was meant to address multiple problems or multiple issues, open space, as well as getting types of housing that we needed. And then in the larger context, it should be tied to a master plan, which is well
Those were the
beyond
three
being
things I
adopted.
wrote
production plan
down.
she spoke of was an affordable housing production
Yeah,
plan.
it's
That's
affordable
not
housing.
Housing in general.
Right, so housing in general, like what type of housing does Wareham need?
It's a
That's
housing
right,
plan,
the
isn't it?
conversion factor was
No,
tied to.
it's a
Or
housing,
you,
excuse me, it's a housing plan that they've done.
The Affordable Housing Trust did a housing plan.
It told us how many affordable housing we had built every year, so to me, that's an affordable.
Just to try to get to the, get out from under 40B, you might say, that it's sort of the plan of the Affordable Housing Trust in conjunction. Well, I mean, it was presented before your board. Did you get any commenters?
At that hearing, I don't think we had anybody there, no, other than these
I
two
know I
women
submitted
that
a
showed
few
up.
comments, but nothing from the general public.
The other piece to this too is if we get the TDRs in place, we also can put another piece in, which is another acronym of TODs, which is Transit Orient Development, which there are a lot of grants and a lot of pieces for, which again pushes multi-unit development, multi-use developments with a transit. I'm not going to say we're going to have railroad, but there's a possibility, of course, you know, with the Cape Rail recently just being purchased by a major rail company out of the Midwest. I think it's Iowa Pacific, has about 80% of Cape Rail and stuff. So there's some things probably could happen there as well. But the bottom line is it also could have bus service. And if you develop these village complexes, you could have bus service going to these villages. And then you can take advantage of what we call TODs, which allows you to have small businesses, apartments above, light manufacturing, and they all have special grant processes available. And that could spur development as well. So one can piggyback to the other.
Next thing you know, you'll be digging up the trolley tracks on Main Street.
Well,
Yeah.
well, but the first step is to assist in this process and, right?
They dug them up during the
This
first sewer
process.
projects, but they're not there.
I'll
Yeah.
find them.
Okay.
Motion,
Let's bring the plane in.
yeah.
Yep.
motion to adjourn?
Well,
No? Are we gonna sum up?
Well, I would say that we'll start setting up some workshops with some of the stakeholders, like Housing Trust and Open Space and ADM and
Maybe conservation.
and if you don't do it on a Tuesday at 7, or 6, right? You can use this place, and then you could work with the cable, right? And they could televise whatever you want, right?
Right.
Then I'll have to hire a makeup crew.
Yeah, well,
There's no-
you need more than a crew.
Yeah,
So then,
there's
just
enough makeup around.
just looking forward, I'm trying to think of how to.
Well, I have to get started the day before.
What would the thing to do would be for us to wait to hear from you, and you can inform Mr. Chairman when you're ready to come meet with us again to explain some things, or how do you want to do it?
And of course, if you want to attend any of these other ones, you're more than welcome. But
Sure, that'd be great.
Because we'll be putting on the planning board agenda.
I was gonna say, you'll notice the,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, you have to, yeah.
Motion to adjourn now?
Second.
Anything else?
thank you for your support.
Thank you for coming in.
Seconds in favor?
Aye, aye, aye.
Adjourn our, motion to adjourn our meeting.
I would entertain.
Before you leave, it's somebody's birthday.